Hello and welcome to episode 114 of the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and 10 years ago I gave up my live streaming career as a radio presenter with one big regret: never getting to interview my hero, the legendary British musician Paul Weller. This podcast exists purely to solve that issue. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Paul. Now, when I first started this podcast, I created a wish list of potential guests. You would as well, right? It's fair to say that Billy Bragg was one of those early entries in my notebook. A musician, author, broadcaster, and left-wing activist who fronted the 1980s Red Wedge movement with, amongst others, Paul Weller. He's also pretty active as a gigging musician, touring the world, so tying him down to a recording was always going to be pretty tricky. And here's one other thing that I should mention. On the release of this podcast right now, Billy is the only guest to come on who I've actually interviewed in my former life as a radio presenter. It was one of my absolute career highlights when working at the BBC in the late 90s. He's a hugely talented singer and songwriter. Think about it, to have and to have not. The Milkman of human kindness, Levi Stubbs' Tears, Sexuality, A New England, You Woke Up My Neighbourhood, Between the Wars, We Laughed. I could go on. Billy continues to surprise and delight with his music, and to my ears, never seems to repeat himself, and much like Paul, is looking to try new things, push himself into new ways of working and creating music. What you're going to hear over the next hour is a love of the jam. You'll hear about that influence that the band and Paul's lyrics had on him as a young man. You'll hear about supporting the Style Council on an early council meeting tour, to the Red Wedge project, where you'll hear nothing but warmth and gratitude for Paul's input and collaboration throughout. We'll also chat about connections from the solo years, and there are plenty of them, from Go Disc's label mates in the 90s to Jules Holland later TV around a Kind Revolution time. And most of all, throughout the hour-long conversation, you'll hear a man who respects Paul as an innovator and as a huge musical talent with an incredible work ethic, vision, and back catalogue. As you can tell, I'm pretty excited about this one, right? So let's get into it. Billy Bragg, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
Oh, this is lovely. I've worked out you're the only person who's come on the podcast that I've interviewed before, which was back when I was at BBC Radio Bristol. It would have been tail end of the 90s, Mermaid Avenue time. And we talked about car boot sales in Yeovil quite a bit.
Oh, yeah, I drove past that the other day. We moved house during the pandemic, not far. The way to get north from here now doesn't involve going to get to the M5. You have to go via Yeovil now. In the old days, you have to go via Honiton. It's a stupid thing, but now it means I drive past that place quite regularly now. The biggest boot sale in Somerset.
That's, yeah. My nan and granddad used to live in Malta.
Oh, right.
And so, we used to go there regularly.
The A37.
I think we spoke about that more than we spoke about the album.
That's what we're doing so far, haven't we? We haven't even mentioned what's his name.
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to be the whole thing. People are going to be so interested to find out how to get to Bristol without going up the M5. Which is sometimes necessary, because the M5, M4 crossroads in summer and weekends can be absolutely nightmare.
Hey, look, this is lovely. I'm so pleased you're on. We're obviously going to talk about your career, your connections with Mr. Weller, but we have to start off, first of all, with you being just a fan. And the Jam were a big thing in your life, right?
They were, yeah. They were really the first of those punk bands that made sense to me and my mates. We were a bit suspicious of the Sex Pistols and the Clash. They seemed a bit, hard to explain really. They seemed a bit art school to me, a bit like student bands initially, before I'd seen them. And there was something about the Jam that had a more of a working class suburban aesthetic, which is where we were. We were working class lads living in the suburbs, and they kind of had a dynamic that related to the things that we were interested in, which was the early albums by the Stones and the Small Faces and the Who around that summer. Because we've been to see the guys that I knocked around with, who was Wiggy, the kid next door, who taught me to play guitar. He was a huge fan of the Faces. And then Bob Handley around the corner, who was the drummer. His tastes were more eclectic, but we'd kind of gravitated towards that summer. We gravitated towards, or the previous summer, 76, we gravitated towards buying the early albums by the Stones, the Who, and the Small Faces. And we were really into that sort of hardcore beat group thing. So the Jam fit right into that. They appeared to us to be straight out of that, like that kind of a modern iteration, I suppose, of that idea. The Feel Goods were part of it as well in some way, kind of like the Feel Goods, but the Feel Goods were a bit older than us, whereas the Jam were the same age as us. So after In the City came out, we went to see them at the Nashville Rooms, the Jam, which was handy because it was on the District line. You just get on at Barking and get off at West Kensington and you're right there. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's literally next door to the tube station. I think it's called the Three Kings now.
Right.
Or the Three times it's on, is it Tolgarth Road that goes down to Hammersmith Broadway? Anyway,
it was a pub, right?
It was a pub, the Nashville. Okay. Yeah, it was called the Nashville Rooms. And on the old pub circuit, it had a kind of country and western vibe. But it was one of the crucibles of punk. The Pistols played there. Me and my little mates played there in Riff Raff in '78. So it was a key venue in that. Like the Red Cow at Hammersmith, we played there. The Jam, I think, played the same week. I've got the advert from the NME from that period. But yeah, it was really amazing to see people our age doing this. And I remember the guy who came on and fixed our amps and put all the mics, made sure everything was okay before they came on, was what appeared to me to be a grey-haired old geezer. And I can remember joking among ourselves, that's probably their dad. Years later, when I met John Weller, I was like, oh, it was their dad. It was a kind of bit of a surprise to meet John. That was incredibly impressive to see him in that context. And then they announced that their next London show would be at the Rainbow Theatre, where they were opening for The Clash. Now, we've sort of been going to the Rainbow. I think we've been to the Rainbow to see the Reformed Small Faces earlier that summer, and we've been there to see Ronnie Lane, Slim Chance. So we knew the Rainbow. It was kind of our kind of gig. And so we duly went along. It was the early first or second night of The Clash's White Riot tour. Oh, it was really amazing. It was the Prefects, the Subway Sect, Buzzcocks. Someone told me the Slits played, but they must have been on at 5:30 before we got there, because I don't remember seeing this. I think I'd remembered seeing them. I don't remember seeing them at all. But the Jam were second on the bill to the Clash. And to be honest, they didn't quite have the energy that they had at the Nashville Rooms. I think, obviously, they'd not worked out how to play an auditorium. They worked out how to play a pub. They were really good at playing pubs. And, a place like the Marquee, they were really good at that. But the energy that they had, that kind of like, leaping, highly sprung energy that they had, it kind of dissipated in the room there. And then the Clash came on and they totally had it. And I think from that moment on, we realized that actually, the Clash had all the things we liked about the Rolling Stones were embodied in the Clash in many ways. Although it was, everyone denied that. It was clear there was a Mick and Keith relationship between Joe and Mick. And they played the same amps as this is the time when we were into amps. And they played the same amps as the Stones. Whereas the Jam were playing these shitty old AC30s, which you could buy at the time. You could buy old AC30s or the Selma equivalent. You could buy them for like, 30 quid up the local secondhand store. It was a bit like, Whereas the Ampeg, Wiggy had an Ampeg that we actually bought off of Ronnie Lane, believe it or not. Yeah, wow. Just out of chance, it was out of a classified ad in Melody Maker that there was an Ampeg for sale, and it was what we wanted. And we had to go on the train to Richmond and bring it back on the train from Richmond. But we didn't meet Laney, but we did meet his roadie, Rush Schlagbaum, who'd been the Faces roadie. So kind of there was something about the Clash that really had a more encapsulated what punk was about, and kind of made me understand what the potential for it was. And then subsequently, we went to see the Clash at Rock Against Racism, and that was my first sort of political activism. But at the same time, the Jam were making records that I thought were really, really interested in. And strangely, when I'm listening to music a lot when I'm driving back and forth to gigs, of all those bands, it's only really the Jam that I still listen to. And they still have the ability to move me. I might have the iTunes on random. Boy About Town might come on and I'll turn it up and start singing at the top of my voice along to that. And I think, the spirit that Paul had then, he kind of still motivates him. And I really admire that. Whereas Joe had kind of, by the mid-'80s, Joe had kind of lost himself in a marijuana bush somewhere. He just wasn't present as a force against Thatcherism, which was a huge disappointment to me during the time of Red Wedge, that he was dismissive of it. And obviously, Lydon's doing adverts for Anchor Butter. I don't think we'll see Paul doing that anytime soon. So out of that group, out of those, and you should throw the Damned in there as well, who always were a bit of a parody, and they still are, but at least they're still playing, and good luck to them. But out of all those, the only person, it seems to me, who stayed true to his principles is Paul. And I think, you really admire that, his ability to do that, his willingness to keep making records. I mean, he's made more records since 2000 than I've made in my entire career, 40 years. The fact he goes back, and that's his job. I don't see making records as my job. Doing gigs is my job, and always has been, really. And I make records when I'm got something to say, or I really should make a record in case people forget I exist. But it's not something I've ever really been into, whereas Paul clearly lives to record and to write. That's the life of an artist. And again, his singular path that he's carved for himself. Most people's absolute limit of people being interested in what they're doing is 10 years. There are very few people that I can think of. Bowie would be one. Obviously, McCartney's another. But Paul, and it's not as if the Jam or the Style Council were as big as the Beatles and have that goodwill around the world. It's a UK thing, really, I think, Paul's fame. But he still remains focused on it. He hasn't I've gone off and done sort of written books to keep myself interested because I'm, a bit sort of, after a while, album tour, you think, what else can I do to break it up a little bit? But Paul's just kept focused on that. And, being someone who's also at a similar path, although not to such great heights. So you got to admire that.
Hey, do you know what? I love this because this is going to be so special. I've only asked one question and already we're 10 minutes in.
And now I've got to get a glass. I haven't got a glass of water. I'm going to lose my voice. So wait down while I get a glass of water.
No, I love this because all I've said is it's fair to say you're a fan. And bang, we're into the memories. We're straight there.
I just wanted to explain to listeners what kind of fan I am.
Yeah, well, let's talk Setting Suns because here we are. This album here, and am I right in thinking this really kind of changed? This was really influential in you joining the army. I read, was that right?
Kind of. Yeah, I wouldn't say it was influential. It brought me into that mindset. I think the dark days of the early 80s as the Cold War was getting stoked up and Thatcher came into power in 79. And it seemed that so many of the ideals of the 60s and 70s were being rejected, not just in pop terms, but also in terms of the post-war consensus, the idea that there is such a thing as the common good and that we, broadly all of us pay our taxes in order that we can all get by. Local councils should provide you with housing and education and social services and healthcare. These ideas were sort of suddenly coming under threat. And the clouds were darkening and my little band had split up and I'd run out of things to do. And where I grew up in Barking in East London. And the main employer there, and when I was at school, was Ford's Motor Company at Dagenham. Everybody's dad either worked for Ford's or worked for one of the ancillary companies that was supplying them, which is what my dad did. He was a warehouse man. So our careers education was every year, all the boys got to go to the main body plant and have a look. I don't know where the girls went. I've absolutely no idea what they did with the girls that day. But we all got to go to the main body plant. And afterwards, if you came back and said you didn't want to work at Ford's, which I didn't, it was like Hades. I'll be perfectly honest with you. It was a dreadful place. In many ways, I learned to play guitar so I wouldn't have to work there.
I think we had a tour around the tractor plant there when we were kids.
Yeah, really not the sort of place where you want to spend your working life, frankly, unless you're really into cars, which I never really was. When I said I didn't want to work there, the careers officer literally said, well, you got three choices in Bragg, the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force, and gave me the brochures to go down. That was it. So when the band broke up and the clouds were darkening, that kind of came back as a means of kind of pressing the eject button on my life. The army came in, and I suppose there was Setting Suns. Up on the hills playing Little Boy Soldiers. There was Armed Forces by Elvis Costello. I was another huge fan of Elvis. And of course, Sandinista had a strong don't join message, the call up. It's up to you not to heed the call up. But the only person who was actually speaking directly to me was Kate Bush with Army Dreamers. And that, Kate recognized that unlike the other three, Kate recognized that working class lads don't always have a lot of choice in these things. Sometimes the only option to escape a situation that fate has cast upon them is to press the eject button on their previous life and go and join the army. And also, I fancied driving a tank. There's not many jobs you can do that in. So despite what Paul said on Setting Suns, I was off. I'd say Sound Effects rather, is probably the most influential album in terms of the jam records for me. There's such great songs on there, great lyrics, great melodies. That will be my sort of. Although I never actually got to see him again after seeing him at that Clash gig. I don't know why. I mean, I was out of circulation up in Northamptonshire playing in my little band, so I didn't really run into Paul again, and until more in the mid-'80s.
You come back to music, obviously, thank Christ. And 83 was your first, let's call it a mini album, because I think that's how we termed it, because it was, 7 tracks, 16 minutes, Life's a Riot with Spy versus Spy. But that puts you on the map. And those songs are still songs that we love and listen to today, my friend. The Milkman of Human Kindness, a New England, tracks like that.
Yeah.
And that's obviously off the tail end of the Jam finishing. Paul's into his new thing with the Style Council. And we'll talk about that connection. But what brought you back to music then?
Well, oddly, one of the other reasons why I wanted to join the army was I thought it would get rid of the idea that I could ever be a singer-songwriter. It would just sort of like drown in the kittens on that ambition. But actually, when I got there, I got more inspired to write more songs. I thought, it's not going to go away. This is really not going to go away. So I thought, well, if I come out, I'll give it one more go. And the way to do it, I thought, was in almost like a kind of like a all or nothing solo electric guitar, almost like fix bayonet and charge and see what happens. And fortunately, at a time when everybody else was zigging towards sort of electronic duos, there was a lot of those about. It was the time of, Soft Cell and Erasure and people like that. Doing what I'm doing kind of stuck out, if you heard me. And anyone who was disappointed the way the kind of punk idea had just gone out of fashion was going to connect with what I was doing. So that was very fortunate in there. And it did have elements of Fire and Skill style Jam in it, I thought. And also, I kind of like Paul's ability to have that cutting edge, but also record something like English Rose, something soft and vulnerable like that. So I was doing that same kind of thing. And that contrast between the sort of hard edge politics and the vulnerable side, Man in the Iron Mask and To Have and To Have Not, that was kind of where I was pitching myself. And that I think there's an element of what the Jam were doing in that, more so than the Clash. Although people sort of thought of me as a one-man Clash because of the politics. But I think it really, stylistically, certainly something like The Busy Girl Buys Beauty, I was riffing on Beat Surrender, I think. That kind of like clipped, I was trying to, do something along those lines. And I think that resonated with Paul, because one of the first things he talked to me about was that song. We talked about songwriting. So he must have picked up on something there that I'd tuned into his wavelengths.
I mean, that's something that both of you have, the career as masters at writing the political lyric, those kind of scathing lyrics in a catchy song that we want to sing along to. And even your latest album, the cracker of these beautiful love songs the songs that make you feel something is just remarkable. And it's an amazing skill, honestly, and from both of you. But let's talk 83 then. So it was late 83 when you first connected. You were on the same bill. I think was it Youth CND or something like that? Around that
was it Youth CND or was it Young Trade Unionists? I think it was somewhere on the South Bank. The Young Trade Unionists had set up a little stage there, and I was playing and Paul came down, and that was the first time I met him. It was kind of late in the year. We're both, if you see the photographs, we're both well wrapped up. But he played my guitar. I just thought that was so great. He borrowed my guitar to play, and I was like, oh, yeah, that's so cool. And I kind of managed to temper my fanboy instincts then. And obviously did see something in that, because shortly after that, I was invited to open on the Style Council tour, which I think might have been the first Style Council tour, was it?
Yeah, it was Council Meetings Part 1. And when you say open, they open.
That's true. They did indeed open, which was really impressive. Really, really impressive that they went out and played Meeting Over Yonder by the Impressions to kick things off, to get everybody in the auditorium, so that when I went on stage, there was people there. And, in many ways, I was very fortunate that the first encounter I had with a bona fide pop star was Paul, because the way he treated people he worked with was very influential on me. I wasn't going out and having a beer with him every night. We weren't knocking around like mates or anything, but he wanted to make sure that I was happy with what I was doing, that my spot that I had was working. Everybody was helping me out and making sure. It made me feel part of, I suppose, really part of the event, but really it was like part of the family, because they were like, the Style Council were like a big family. You've got John there in charge, you've got Uncle Kenny, Kenny Wheeler sorting things out, and then Paul as the kind of like, the front of house and star of the show, and the guy who's wants you to be there. You're not there because you're there to sell tickets. You're there because he likes what you're doing and thinks that you have something to bring to the show. And I very much felt that. I very much felt that we were part of the whole thing, you know, and trying to get involved in that. In 1984, you got to remember, the miners' strike's just around the corner. And, you know, Artists Against Apartheid is already up and running. Nicaragua Solidarity. There's a lot of stuff already going on. I mean, my early 1984 was just a run of benefit gigs interspersed with the Style Council tour. And it was a great thing to be part of because I was on the bus with them, you know, because it was just me solo. I was traveling with them on the bus and we did some amazing gigs. I think we played the last ever gig at the Glasgow Apollo, which was an amazing place. It had a double balcony and the balconies moved. I was with Andy Kershaw at the time. We decided to go and watch the Style Council's first bit from the audience that night. I don't know why we did, but I'm glad we did because when the Style Council came on, the noise that the audience made was a noise akin to Concorde taking off. I'd never heard a noise like it before. It was just incredible. And it was really helpful to me because it revealed me a really important thing that you need to know if you're going to play in Glasgow, which is that the noise the audiences there make when they like you is the same noise that other audiences make when they're going to kill you. So not to be put off when they really, really go off like a rocket because they're really into what you're doing. You know, my first proper gig back, it's actually the second gig of the tour, but the first one that felt like a proper gig on my tour last year. I was very fortunate to get a tour in between the end of Omicron and the end of Delta and the start of Omicron. I was by pure coincidence, but the first real proper It's Good to Be Back was the Barrowland Ballroom in Glasgow on a Saturday. The audience was just so pleased to be back. I was so pleased to be back. I think I played 7 more songs and we're in the set and came off stage there. The Glasgow audiences are just so great for that sort of thing. And that was my introduction to the fan mania that was still, there was still a bigger element, you know, a lot of Jam fans in those audiences. And they still had that same kind of Paul belongs to us kind of attitude. You know, people hadn't got bored of that then. So watching Paul deal with it, watching how Paul approach the whole idea of connecting with the fans and what he was doing was really, for me, it was great. You know, I could have gone out with any name band at the time and probably been, you know, peripheral to the proceedings, just a bloke who come on and played and then he was gone. But that wasn't how it worked at all. And it was all down to Paul's personal attention to the way the tour was running and who he was working with and why they were there. I was very, very fortunate to have that experience as my first experience with a proper pop star.
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, because it's really unique where they come on first, then it's you, then the questions, then I think you came back, then the Style Council. Let's talk about some of those characters that you brought up. So John Weller, there's so many amazing stories that have come through on this podcast, but you used to call him Mr. Weller, didn't you? You say,
yeah, he kind of, you know, he was a figure that I was very familiar with growing up, you know, the builder. Mr. Weller, the builder. And my manager, Peter Jenner, who'd managed Pink Floyd and The Clash and Ian Dury and the Blockheads, had been to public school. Pete wasn't a kind of character I ever really met in life. I only met him in later years. And I kind of, you know, I used to take the mickey out of him about, you know, for instance, the band Crass, you know, the punk anarchist band Crass. He used to pronounce that as Crass. And I used to be, Pete, you can't say that, mate. Don't keep saying that. You've got to say Crass. Stop Crass, you know. Whereas John, as soon as I met him, I knew exactly from the working class background that I came from, him and Kenny as well, to some extent. I was on completely familiar ground with them, knew exactly where they were coming from. And I understood, you know, when John expressed his opinion and I saw where that was coming from, he was very skeptical about the politics, you know. He was probably a working class Tory. I don't know that at all, but he respected what Paul was doing. But he was also very skeptical about the politics of it all as well when we were doing Red Wedge. But, you know, Paul was to some extent as well. So I respected that. But yeah, him and Kenny, I really got on with them. I suppose I was like one of Paul's mates who would come around in the evening, you know, before we went up to the pub. That kind of relationship, you know. You know, I'm sure it'd been the same. I don't remember meeting his mum. I'm sure she was around, but it would have been the same, you know. Yeah. Evening, Mrs. Weller. Oh, you're nice to see you. We're just going up the pub with Paul. It's that sort of relationship, you know, which was lovely. That's how they worked. That's how the Paul Weller machine worked. And that was a huge advantage when it came to Red Wedge because we just plugged into the way they did things. Yeah,
and we'll talk about Red Wedge in a second. What was the Kenny Wheeler story where didn't you have a bet with Kenny?
He would find people who were late on the bus and he would find us a fiver. This is on the Red Wedge tour. Because it was like herding cats, the Red Wedge tour, and it was his job. Unfortunately, I think the Red Wedge ensemble was less familiar less familiar with him than the Style Council lot. He was kind of like their teacher and, kind of get him in control. But it was harder for him with Red Wedge. And he was late for the bus and we find him. Gave it back to him, and I think he framed it. Yeah, we caught him on that. But that wasn't his greatest faux pas. He made an even better faux pas when we were coming back from Newcastle at the end of the tour, and we stopped at Newport Pagnell or somewhere, one of those places, might have been the Blue Boar, on the M1. We all get back on the bus, and after about half an hour on the road, someone says, "Where's Mick Talbot? Where's Mick? Where's Mick Talbot?" And we've left Mick Talbot. And this is the day before mobile phones and Uber and stuff like that. So poor old Mick has got left. He probably could still be there if it weren't for the fact that he had to use his own bushcraft that he learned in the Merton Parkers to get back to. Can you imagine how many Style Council fans are coming in for a cup of tea and you're like, "Oh, Mick Talbot, hello, mate, where are you going? You can't drop me at a tube station, could you?" I don't know how he got back, but yeah, that was Kenny Wheeler's worst nightmare. He got Paul, but he lost Mick.
Brilliant. I love it. So let's talk Red Wedge. I'm particularly interested in the lead up to it because 85, we'd had the miners' strike you mentioned. You'd had the Jobs for Youth tour and you were doing lots of benefits at that time. Paul, the same. So I'm guessing that's where your worlds start to collide. And there was this meeting at Labour HQ, July 1985, which I'm guessing was the start of Red Wedge. There was you and Paul there. Would that be right?
Yeah, I mean, the Jobs for Youth tour was, I went out on the road with the Labour Party to see what would happen. Basically, it was a kind of like a dry run for the Red Wedge project. So it was both to see how the Labour Party would respond to someone coming in with their own agenda and meeting them halfway. Could they work with that? And also to see how the press reacted to it, whether the press would pour piss on it, or whether they would see in the context of the mid-1980s that this was a practical thing to do. Because the basic idea about Red Wedge wasn't that we were all necessarily huge fans of the Labour Party. I was a member of the Labour Party because I felt if I'm going to engage with them, I really should properly engage with them. But really, Red Wedge, what bound us together was our opposition to Margaret Thatcher. That was the thing that we were all agreed with. So with the end of the miners' strike, that was such a heartbreak. The question then became, what do we do now? Do we just kind of go back to being in smash hits and doing Top of the Pops? Or do we carry on trying to use music to bring about some kind of change? And the only viable vehicle for defeating Margaret Thatcher was the Labour Party in the 1987 election. So it seemed to me a good idea to see if people were up for that. So I went out on the Jobs for Youth tour and it was well received and the Labour Party were interested. The key thing was, I think, that Labour had a new leader, Neil Kinnock. And what's significant about Kinnock was he was the first leader of a political party who was born after 1940. So he was of that generation that gave us all the great bands of the 1960s. He grew up listening to pop music and he understood how music could make a difference. He was the kind of person you could sit down and have a chat with him about The Who or about the Beatles or, whereas you can't imagine ever having a conversation about anything really that you had in common with Margaret Thatcher. So that was really significant. So his Labour Party, his leadership kind of created a situation where something like Red Wedge could happen. Although I stressed that Red Wedge was independent of the Labour Party. It was our own initiative and we came to them with our ideas. They would never have allowed us to call it Red Wedge. In fact, Lynn Franks was at the meeting where we were discussing Red Wedge and she said, Red Wedge. Doesn't that sound a bit socialist? And there was a tumbleweed moment in the room. And I said, yeah, that's the point, Lynn. And then we moved on. That was the kind of relationship we had with them. There was that element in there where they were like, much, as cautious as they are today, really, about that. But we were a bit more gung-ho, having been politicized by the miners' strike. And so Kinnock was absolutely crucial. But Paul really was the absolute crucial aspect of it, because otherwise it would have been Billy Bragg and a load of little lefty Herberts. But Weller, I think I'm right in saying Weller was the only artist who did miners' benefits and Live Aid. I don't think anybody else did that. Anybody else was in those two spaces. And he was huge at the time. I think, is it Our Favourite Shop? And just been massive. Massive. And Walls Come Tumbling Down. In many ways, he had the most to lose. He had the most to lose in terms of his career if it all went tits up. But he committed himself to it 100% and, made the whole Style Council infrastructure available to us. Basically, the Style Council were the backing band for everybody on the tour. Not that I needed a backing band, but everybody else, the ability of people to come in and play was predicated on the Style Council opening their operation to everybody who wanted to come. Because beyond the initial sort of hardcore of the tour, which was the Stylies, the Communards, myself, Junior Giscombe, and Lorna G, there, people would turn up and want to play. Johnny Marr came with me. He came along and played a few songs with me in my set. And some of the guys from Madness came along and they sang with the Style Council. And Tom Robinson would come along and guest. And by the time we got to Newcastle, the entire Smiths had turned up. The Smiths played that night.
I love the way this is building and building as you go through. Yeah,
it was incredible feeling on the tour. And whatever people say about the politics in reflection, the tour was just absolutely brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. It had that feel of the Motown Review tours or the Stax Review, with loads of bands playing together. And I think another thing was crucial about it was we were kind of, when you think of that initial lineup, so Paul, Jimmy, Junior, Lorna, and me, we're all kind of, obviously not Lorna, but we're all soul boys. And Lorna was more came from a kind of reggae thing, but really we were all kind of soul boys. So connecting with that Motown Review thing was subconscious. But I think we were all, the choice of songs that we were singing, a lot of Curtis Mayfield stuff, It just had a great feel. It really felt like we were the unity that we sang about, we were embodying it. And the audiences just loved it. The audiences lapped it up. It was a great thing to be part of.
So Anna Joy David, who was heavily involved in this with you and Paul, has been on the podcast. And the thing is, it wasn't just these amazing gigs, but it was also these incredible day events as well. So you'd go into the communities, you'd work with young people, you'd have workshops and panels and discussions and that kind of thing as well, right?
Yeah, this is crucial what Anna Joy brought to it, because otherwise it would have just been gigs. Or it wouldn't just been gigs because we had the politicians there. What we did was, rather than allow politicians to give speeches, we would introduce the local Labour politicians to the audience at the beginning of the gig and then send them in the foyer if people wanted to talk to them. I remember one leaving the gig. So we finished and we'd unloaded and we've got in the bus from Birmingham, and Claire Short, a local MP, is still standing there with her back against a pole that's holding up the balcony, surrounded by spiky punks, still debating politics, smoking a cigar. And I was like, that's my kind of politician. That is my kind of politician. And it was good. It was, it was interesting. They weren't angry debating. They were really engaged in the whole thing. And that was, one end. And the other end, there was the Labour Party in Derby who didn't want us to come there because, and this is what they told us, we don't have any young people in Derby. So it wasn't fabulously embraced everywhere. But Anna Joy was the key organizer in the day events. She and her team were doing outreach to people, and that really gave so much more context to what we were trying to do. So what would happen at the day event, when we got to town, while the crew was setting up the stage, we would go to, a local youth centre or a library, it might be, or a community centre. And then how many of us were free would sit down with local MPs and take questions from young people and talk about what we were trying to do and talk about the viability of the Labour Party. And they were really, really fascinating. I mean, some places, I think we were in Wrexham, where guys said, we don't need the Labour Party here, Bill. We need, give us guns. We need guns to deal with this. I was like, well, that's a bit serious. But yeah, it was cool. I mean, it was hard because at the same time, the Labour Party Young Socialists who were hosting a lot of these gigs had been heavily infiltrated by militant. So there was a bit of this going on between the Labour Party and the LPYS, which is why the Derby people didn't want us to come, probably, because they didn't want people joining the LPYS. But we were trying to keep out of that and not become sectarian and make them work together. So that we're not going to do this unless you work together to do this. And most of the time there was a couple of places where the LPYS overpromised a bit. We were in a difficult situation there, but most of the time it worked really well. And again, that was down to Anna Joy, who, I don't know why she never ended up in Parliament, Anna Joy. She would have made a great parliamentarian. She went off, I think, after the, because we were still kind of doing stuff after 87, after 93. 93, in some ways, Red Wedge was still active then, not Paul's involvement, but the rest of us were on a smaller level. But that in some ways was more of a kick in the teeth than 87, because Thatcher had gone and we thought, yeah, we're finally going to see the fruition of what we put so much work in to get Kinnock as Prime Minister. And the failure of that knocked a lot of people sideways. A lot of friends of mine who've been activists, they went off to do other things like train as teachers or go and become nurses, other ways of being part of the common good. And Anna Joy went off to live in Spain. And I think if she'd have stuck around and gone and found herself a Labour seat somewhere, she could have easily been one of those that huge influx of women that came in with Blair in 1997. Whether she felt comfortable with it, I don't know. But I always felt that she would have been great in that role. It's one of those things. She made her life choices, and I respect them, of course. But it would have been great to see her bring her focus and her politics. She still has that radical streak. It would have been great to have someone like that in Parliament.
Absolutely. One of the things that came through, I think, in my chat with Anna Joy David on the podcast was this kind of discussion we had around this lack of ideas in politics right now, this lack of ambition to try new things, to do things differently. And that was something that came out of Red Wedge, wasn't it? That kind of first Blair, that new Labour manifesto came off the back of, so many of those ideas came off the back of Red Wedge, really.
Well, a lot of the ideas were in there. Yeah, I mean, we had our own manifesto, which was signed off by Neil Kinnock, which touched on so many issues that are still current today, the climate, LGBTQI rights, although the alphabet didn't go that far in those days. Those kind of issues that have always engaged young people, we were pushing hard to get those in there. And certainly Peter Mandelson, who was hanging around a lot at the time, his office was next door to the place where we used to meet in Labour Party headquarters. He certainly picked up ideas of presentation, ideas of connectivity, I think, the way you would do things. So not to suggest that Red Wedge was a precursor of New Labour, but they were certainly about updating the Labour Party. I mean, the first gig I ever did for the Labour Party, which was in the European elections in 1984, the headline act of the cultural event was Clive Dunn, from Dad's Army.
Dad's Army?
Yeah, he was as Grandad, dressed up as Grandad, singing these old Grandad songs. And I'm like, I'm there singing To Have and To Have Not, and I'm like, this is weird. They didn't really have that cultural dynamic going on. The arts minister was Norman Buchan, who'd been a folk singer in the 50s, the shadow arts minister in Scotland. And, it kind of didn't really connect with us at all. So we were looking for people like, Ken Livingstone, who was doing great stuff at the GLC, putting on free gigs in Battersea Park and stuff like that, were much, much more on our wavelengths, as was Kinnock. Kinnock always was a staunch supporter of Red Wedge, even when some in the Labour Party were warning him that we was, liable to say things that he didn't agree with. I still get texts from him every now and then so if I've said something on Twitter or, he sees something that he thinks connects with what I'm doing. He drops me a line, which is great. He was, it's a shame he was never Prime Minister. He made a great Prime Minister.
Now, look, the other thing I wanted to ask you about was that of how it kind of ended for Paul, because there's the final event I can find where you're both together is DJing with Norman Cook. This is pre-Fatboy Slim, right? This was a club night in February 1988. Would that be right?
Yeah, it was at the Town and Country Club. I'll tell you what was funny about that night is we all took turns in DJing. Obviously, we weren't really paying much. We were all in the backstage dressing room where the drinks were free. Because I spoke to someone afterwards there and he said, why did you, every 30 minutes, we had to listen to The Revolution Will Not Be Televised by Gil Scott-Heron. Because everybody played it. We didn't realise it would be like, no, not again. Like, come on, this is the first 3 times was fine, but after about the 6th time, everyone was like, yeah. I think, after 87, the defeat in 87 kind of knocked the wind out of Red Wedge, of course, which is bound to, because that was what our focus was. There were other initiatives that carried on, but Paul afterwards never was quite as engaged as he had been during the election campaign. And when I read about him saying, I was, very skeptical about the politicians, they were just using us. I mean, he was saying that at the time. He said it to me all the time. So I've got no counter to that. All I can say was, look, respect, mate, because despite that, you still put your career on the line for us. So I've got no qualms with him saying that, and when people mention it to me, I'm like, yeah, well, they were. We were using them and they were using us. That's the deal. And for some of us, that's the pragmatic aspect of politics. But for other people, that impinges on their principles. And if that's how Paul feels now, well, I respect that because that's how he felt at the time.
There's all these other little connections which we must talk about before you go. So one, you mentioned kind of finding other things to do outside of the music and writing. And there was the book Roots, Radicals and Rockers, which was how skiffle changed the world. And there's a Paul Weller connection with it. Didn't you give Weller a copy of the book?
I did. That was the last time I saw him. They had me on later.
With Jules Holland, right?
Yeah. He was on promoting A Kind Revolution. Wow, What a great album that is.
Oh, yeah.
What a great album. He played The Cranes Are Back. Oh, it's so beautiful.
I was going to mention that song.
He played that and I was like, oh, yeah, I'm buying this. This is definitely going in the car stereo. He said, well, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, do you want a copy? And I gave it to him. And it was, the hardback was, he said, bloody hell. He said, that's a bit of a, I said, well, yeah, it's a book, Paul, isn't it? Scott, it's like, I said to him, you should write one. You should. He said, no. Too busy making records, which is true. Yeah, give him his due. But I'd love to read a book he wrote. I'd love to read that. Yeah. His take on it all. Because, he was right there at the beginning. He's, both in terms of punk, but also in terms of his career. I mean, he kind of like almost went from school to being in the Jam. And I think that would be a really interesting book to read, and how how he's managed to stay true to himself. In the end, I think that's all you can do. You can't expect to be the fulcrum on which the world changes. That's very, very, very few people get to be that person, and not many, even a smaller number of artists who get to do that. But to be able to have a vision, and what's the North Star that Paul navigates by to be able to do that? Because I get lost. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I get lost. I mean, particularly during the pandemic, I was like, no gigs, no nothing. And I wrote an album and recorded an album. To do that from a standing start was like, whoa. I had to start with a blank sheet of paper. I've never done that before. Whereas Paul seems to just roll on. And it's not like he's making the same album over and over again like Oasis. He's kind of like, he's over there. He's gone here. He's this way. He's like, whoa, there's something going on here. There's someone who really has a vision. And I'd be very interested to hear him talk about that, to hear him reflect on it. I think he's, in interviews, I think he's a bit, still, I don't know why, I thought he's still a bit defensive. He's still a bit like, keeps his cards to his chest. Again, I respect that. You don't want the press all over you. But I'd love to hear him thinking out loud in a book, where he's got pages and pages to be able to just, this is how I came to this place. And this is how I dealt with that bit in between the Style Council and Wildwood, which was a real tough time for him, a really tough time. And I'm really pleased it was my record label, or a record label that I worked with, Godis, that gave me something. In fact, my partner, Juliet De Valero Wills, was really absolutely key to getting Paul to sign up to Godis. That was great as well.
There's another future guest on the podcast then.
Yeah. If you get to talk about it.
Story.
She was also a key player in Two Tone. She managed Selector.
Oh, wow.
And worked with Jerry Dammers and very closely with Jerry and Rick Rogers. But she won't, I'm like, why don't you write a book? Write a book. Some people just don't fancy it, do they?
No. Exactly.
Whereas I sort of kind of got into it really through, when you sort of write 1,000 words on Facebook, you think, oh, this isn't that hard, actually. I could probably do this. But not everyone's like that.
Particularly when it's a topic you're passionate about, right? And you're obviously in that space.
Always write what you know. Don't be trying to write about something. I had a chip on my shoulder about skiffle. It was disrespected, and I thought it shouldn't be. So that, and my experience in punk being very similar to skiffle and being a DIY anti-commercial genre of music was really, really helpful in that.
You mentioned, let's talk about that lockdown period. And as a touring musician, I mean, Christ, that must be terrifying, I would have thought. But how you approached that was similar to how Paul approached his album Fat Pop. You were kind of sending bits off to friends and colleagues and people you were working with, right? And little voice notes, which is a new thing I've read about Paul. It's all like things recorded in the phones and stuff like that. So you work in very similar ways on that one.
Yeah, no, that's not normally how I work. I normally go in the studio and I'm sitting in there with everybody nodding and, frowning if something happens that I don't like. And that usually locks me into the process and I start writing more songs, so I really get focused. Because I'm not writing songs all the time. I'm just, I need reason to, unless one grabs me by the scruff of the neck and won't let go until I write it. But yeah, that was a really, really interesting process. And collaborating with Romeo Stoddart and Dave Izumi, who were the joint producers, and also arrangers. I wanted to work with people who did arrangements. So that was kind of interesting. And I know Paul's smart enough to know that you can freshen things up by collaborating with people. I see the people that and not necessarily name people, people that he respects and people that he feels he has some kind of intuitive connection with. And that is always interesting. One of the best experiences I ever had in the studio was making Mermaid Avenue with Wilco, which was 100% collaboration, complete immersion. And I really, really enjoyed that because it took the pressure off me being the bloke who has to say, what song is next, how we're going to sing it, and what biscuits we're going to have at tea break. But
also on that one, it's not even the words were coming from Woody Guthrie as well, right? So it's similar to Paul on True Meanings, where he was working with other writers on some of the songs. He wasn't even, and I read some stuff about him saying like he loved that experience. He didn't have to worry about what he was writing and how his words would be interpreted because they weren't his. And I guess it's that similar experience.
Exactly the same. Yeah. When I rang Natalie Merchant to ask her to come and sing on the record, she said, "You're making an album and you don't have to write no words?" I'm like, yeah. So actually like, wow, that's great. So yeah. But I mean, I think in that you can see Paul trying to, freshen up the way he makes records. Okay, I've done it that way. What's another way to do this? How do we do this another way? And I'm kind of got to that stage now. I'm thinking like, if I'm going to make a record, it really needs to be engaging. The album before, Tooth and Nail, was recorded in 5 days in the basement of Joe Henry's house in Pasadena. I've never done that before. That was a real challenge. Can I do this? How do we do this? How does that work? So, if I'm going to make a record, and then in between, I made an album on a train in America. So if I'm going to make a record, it needs to be something that's not just go in the studio and record. It has to be engaging. And I think you can see that in Paul's in the 21st century anyway, the albums that he's made. He's looking at ways to do it differently every time and not just do it by rote. Obviously his earlier solo albums, he's building up his confidence and his style. But I think since 2000, he's been on a really interesting journey. And sometimes I get where he's coming from. Other times he's gone off in the bushes somewhere. I can hear him thrashing about over there. And then I think, I don't know where he's going. And then boom, he's suddenly back on the track in front of me singing about, Hopper's paintings and stuff like that. So you can always trust him to find something interesting.
Well, let's talk about it. Here it is. This is your 10th studio album, right? So the million things that never happened. And there's a lot of content on there as well. If you think back to that mini LP at the beginning and the 7 tracks of 16 minutes or whatever, there was a lot you did want to say in this LP, right? And we're kind of days away from you heading over to the US and Canada to get back on the road. It must be really exciting to be able to tour that album this time around.
Yeah, I am looking forward to that because it's been a long time. Over the last few years, unlike Paul, I go to America a lot. I averaged since 1984, I averaged a couple of trips a year. Not always to tour, but I'm very fortunate that there's an audience there, the old college radio audience, who are kind of still into what I'm doing. I'm not playing massive shows, but, most cities, I can hit most of the major cities there and find a decent club audience. And I feel very privileged in doing that. And particularly at a time when the politics in America are the way they are, it's really an interesting time for me to go over there and play. It's a shame that Paul didn't really get over there because there was a lot of strong Jam fans. And when I used to go in the early days, people were always talking to me about Paul, particularly in California. There's a very strong mod vibe over there. It's a pity Paul didn't engage with the Americans a little bit more, maybe. But then again, he is, without wishing to be offensive, there is something quintessentially English about the way he works and the way he is as a person, not in his music. His music is a much broader palette than that. But he kind of has a kind of, this is me and take me as I am. This is what I do. You don't feel he wants you to love him. He wants you to hear him. He wants you to appreciate him, but he ain't going to pander to where he thinks you are. He's going to, forge his own, there's a line in The City, you better listen now, you've said your bit. That sums up Paul's attitude to me. I think it was right there at the beginning. It's right there now. It's still there now. He's the governor.
I love it. Well, look, it's going to be really exciting to see you back out on the road. I know there's also the tour that's just been announced with Paul Heaton and Jackie Abbott as well, which is going to be amazing. Yeah,
that's great. Tickets are going like gangbusters for that, so that's really great. Although I did see someone saying that the only dream addition to that would be Paul Weller. And I could see where those people are coming from. That would be, but it's going to be great for Paul and Jackie, but with Weller as well, that would be...
Yeah, that'd be brilliant.
It wouldn't be Red Wedge because notoriously the House Martins wouldn't do Red Wedge because we wouldn't come out in favour of abolishing the monarchy.
Oh, really?
I
didn't know that.
Yeah,
that's the reason for not
that was their reason, yeah.
And then next year, New Zealand and Australia 2023
as well. So. All around the world.
Well, look, the new album is fantastic, I have to say. It's a really lovely listen, man. And it's so good that you're kind of still doing it, still producing the music, because that's a joy for us fans as much as for yourself, I imagine. So
thank you.
Yes, man. I have 2 final questions for you before you go, right? You're allowed 1 Paul Weller song for the rest of your life. It can be the Jam, the Star Council, or solo. What are you going to go with?
Well, obviously, for me, it would be the Jam. And I think it will probably be That's Entertainment.
You talked to Paul about that song as well.
I did talk to him about it, early on. He was very dismissive of it. This might have been probably Red Wedge time, because we had a conversation about this and Levi Stubbs' Tears. In fact, that's what started it. He came up while I was, and I didn't have Levi Stubbs' Tears on that first tour, so it must be Red Wedge. And I was playing Levi Stubbs' Tears in the sound check, and he came up while I was still on stage. He said, "Is that Levi Stubbs in the Four Tops?" I'm like, "Yeah, Paul, it is, yeah." And he said to me, "I thought you was a folk singer." And I said, "Yeah, Paul, it's kind of soul folk, It's like, the album by the Staple Singers, Soul Folk in Action, that's kind of that thing." And he said, "Oh, you should show me how to play that. Sounds interesting." I said, "Yeah, sure. If you show me how to play That's Entertainment." He was like, Wrote it in 10 minutes. He was very dismissive. He did this whole thing about how much better the demo was. And eventually when I heard the demo, I was like, you know what you're talking about. And it reminds me now, because I have tracks where I think the demo is better, but we never captured that thing on the demo. And whenever I listen to the demo, that's entertainment. I'm like, that's such bullshit. I think any songwriter who has the balls to put in a line like two lovers missing the tranquility of solitude into a song, you've got to respect that. Yeah. Oh, that's such a great line. And in that song as well, which is a really gritty urban song. I mean, the reason I love it is it really reminds me of my world in the mid-70s. The concrete, crummy sirens, smell of piss, rotten beer, power cuts. It's like, that's entertainment. It's all there. But suddenly out of that comes this line, two lovers missing the tranquility of solitude. It's like, oi, Shakespeare, what are you doing here? Go and get a proper job. It's like that, really. It's like finding a diamond in a gasometer.
Yeah.
Just really, really, really beautiful. And so it always, as soon as I hear those strummed chords, it kind of has everything that a great jam song does, I think, It's really a working class thing. I think the Jam were the great working class British band for expressing working class sentiments, Saturday's Kids, those kind of songs, they really spoke to me of my youth.
Hey, look, there's one thing I should ask. I mean, it'd be remiss of me not to ask you about where we are right now, the times that we're in right now, because my God, it's pretty bleak, and what's about to happen this winter is terrifying, quite frankly. What's your view as, you mentioned being a member of the Labour Party back then. I don't know if you still are, but obviously anti-Tory. What do they need to do to make a change to get into power?
Well, that's a very good question, isn't it? I think we're past that at the moment. I think people are looking for extra parliamentary activity. That's why people are much more supportive of people going on strike than they were back in the 70s and the 80s. In the 70s and the 80s, prices were rising, but wages were rising as well. And what's happened now is prices are rising, but wages are stagnating. So the gap is getting bigger. The cost of living crisis that we're facing is, really going to affect millions and millions of people. And everyone knows that the government has it within their power to do something about this, because we've seen it, in the pandemic. But before that, we saw it in quantitative easing, where the government created money to give to the banks, ostensibly to loan to people, but they didn't do that. They used it to shore up their bottom line. So we know the government can act if they want to do this, but their reluctance to do it, I think that's going to be the point on which the Tories finally come a cropper. And I'm hoping the Labour Party can find the wherewithal to articulate that idea of a we have to do this for the common good. And I think the idea of the common good has some currency from the pandemic, the willingness of people to mask up and to get vaccinated and to look after one another. I mean, I know there were a few sort of crazy anti-mandate people, but they're just, people who think the world revolves around them. In the end, the majority of people recognize that we were doing this in the common good. So that spirit, I think, where we all work together to get ourselves out of this difficult situation is going to manifest itself in this coming winter. Whether the Labour Party can connect with that or not, we'll have to wait and see. But I think in the end, it's going to be people power, people getting organised, whether that's in unions or food banks or some kind of social collective. I think that's going to happen before the Labour Party get on board, which is a shame. But they seem to be sort of, after the Corbyn leadership, they seem to be scurrying back to the safety of the centre ground at a time when all the things that Corbyn was talking about, spending money insulating people's homes, free broadband communism, they dismissed that as. All the things that Corbyn was talking about, people are now saying, there was an editorial in the article in the Times today saying that, the road protesters who sat in the road, insulate Britain, were right. Despite the fact that the Tories, ripped them a new arsehole when they were stopping Range Rovers from driving around the M25. That change is coming. And the Tories are going back to their Thatcherite comfort zone. And Keir Starmer turns out to be more than a Blairite than he gave the impression when he was running for leader, when he made a big thing about, carrying on the positive aspects of Corbynism. So, yeah, I'm not holding my breath waiting for him to wake up and smell the coffee. But there are good people out there. People who sort of connected with Red Wedge, people like Andy Burnham, who seem to understand where we're going and how to deal with these problems, who are stepping up and saying, look, the Labour Party should be doing with this. So the thing that's most important in these times for those of us who want to make the world a better place is not to give in to our cynicism. There's enough cynicism out there to go around. You don't need to be cynical as well, mate. And I think for musicians, this is really important because I didn't really think in these ways in Red Wedge, but I now recognize that empathy is the actual currency of music. Whatever music you're making, it's really all about connecting with other people and making people feel they're not alone. And I know Paul is aware of that because, I've worked with him, I've listened to him. He still has that strong sense of empathy in his music. And I think we need to reconnect with that in society. There's a bit of a war on empathy. Anyone who speaks out on a compassionate idea gets piss poured on them and called a woke, whatever that means. It's ridiculous. Yeah, the young generation now, I think I think they're more political than they were in the 1980s, but they're less ideological. There's no point in people looking for a new Billy Bragg to write There Is Power in Union. Young people articulate their ideas in different ways now, but there are lots of, plenty of people out there who are connecting with, I've run a stage at Glastonbury called Left Field with my partner, Juliet Wills. We had Jamie Webster there from Liverpool, and he had them chanting, fuck the Tories. I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool. Yeah, we never went that far. And his songs aren't ostensibly political in the way that mine are, but they are all about community and supporting one another and lifting up those people. It's about empathy, It's about empathy. And I think a winter of discontent will bring more of those kind of people to the fore. There's bands out there like Benefits, who are kind of like a Sleaford mods, but they're not shy about the politics. Bob Villan is out there. He's a kind of rapper who's talking very heavily about in politics. It's happening out there, but music no longer is the only social medium available to young people to speak. So it's lost some of its ability to dominate youth culture in the way that it did. In the 20th century, music was the only social medium we had. If you walked around with a Jam record under your arm or Style Council on your arm, album on your arm, you're making a statement. You were saying, I'm this person. Particularly with an artist like Paul, he told you how to dress. He told you how to how to carry yourself. Nobody took that advice off me. He was the style and I was the content. It was the kind of yin and yang. And then, as you can see from my T-shirt, it remains the same. That aspect, music no longer has that vanguard role, but it still does have the ability to bring people together in the way we brought people together in Red Wedge and during the miners' strike and for other issues, for other causes. And I know Paul is still tuned into that because he did a gig for Corbyn. For all his dismissive, I don't do them, I was so pleased to see that because that's the Paul Weller I know. And I know he has not lost that because I hear it in his music. It's just whether he's willing to stick his head over the parapet. And his willingness to do that for Red Wedge was absolutely colossal. We wouldn't be talking about it if Paul hadn't had the courage to do that and put his entire career on the line and say, yeah, I'm standing up for this that nobody's ever done before with the Labour Party, the boring old mainstream Labour Party, the shabby old Labour Party, the unglamorous Labour Party. I'm going to bring all of my stardust and all of my sort of pop credibility, and I'm going to put it into this because of the times and because of the threat that Thatcherism presents to me and my generation. I feel I must do this. And I think Paul is still a writer driven by conscience. And his support for Corbyn's not an easy thing to support. I'm still getting stick about it, to stick up for someone. He's unfortunately a divisive figure because he's not in person himself, Jeremy, a divisive figure at all, quite the opposite. But the way he was portrayed and kind of, messed around by the press, it's quite a divisive thing to come out and support him. So Paul doing that just was like a nod to anyone who's still watching those principles that he had back in the day, although he's kind of might think otherwise now. He's still willing to step up when it counts. So let's not be surprised if we don't see him do something in the coming 6 months.
One other question I had to ask you about, I read this, but something you had in common, you and Paul. Don't you both clip newspaper articles about yourselves? Is this right?
It's a really great thing. It was the first time I went to meet him at Solid Bond, which was near Marble Arch, his studio, to talk about Red Wedge and to talk about the ideas behind it. He said, yeah, come and see me. So I went over to see him and we sat in, I don't know if it was his office, we sat in an office there. And while I chatted to him, he was just cutting out his press for the week. And it was just something that I'd do. I was terrible in the early days. I used to buy 2 copies of the NME in case I lost one. I was terrible at it. But the fact that Paul did it himself said something to me like, this is an authentic guy. This is a guy who's, he's just like me, really. He's not that big pop star who's got loads of flunkies running around doing his will. He's one of the biggest pop stars in Britain today. And here he is. He's bought the music papers. He's cutting out his press and putting it in. Folder. That to me was, that was a key moment of bonding with me and Paul. I don't know what he thought about me. I have no idea. But for me, when I was looking to find if Paul Weller was real or just a construct like Boy George, a completely made up construct, Paul was real and he still is real. And that's something that is a very strange job to do. Trust me, and to hold on to your authenticity is not easy. And, respect to Paul because he's managed to do it over 4 or 5 decades now.
Hey, look, this has been so special, man. I've loved every second of this. I do have one final question for you. Yep. So the purpose of this podcast is to talk to amazing people like yourself, talk about their careers, your music, in your case, and your connections with Mr. Weller. But it's also for me to get the interview with Paul Weller that I never managed during my radio career. And you are the only person who's been on this podcast that I've interviewed before, back in my former day, that former life and that. But I never got the interview with Paul. If it happens off the back of this podcast, what should I ask him? What should I talk to him about?
Where'd you buy your socks? You always had the best socks on Red Wedge tour. I was like, they're incredible. Those socks. There's so much attention to detail. Where are you getting those socks, Paul? That might be the ultimate Paul Weller question, actually.
It could be. I think you're right.
Good to speak to you, Dan. I really hope you do get to interview him. In the meantime, it's been great talking about this music I love, Jam, Style Council and Paul's solo stuff. It's been really great talking about it. And the Red Wedge as well. It's really nice to revisit all that kind of stuff. Something that I would, if the time presented itself again, I would do again. I mean, it's particular, those things don't come around again. But I feel sure that if it did and I had to go out and do that, Paul would be there as well. He'd also recognize artists should do more than just sing about shit. They should actually try and do something about it.
Oh, man. Billy Bragg, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, man. Good to speak to you, Dan. Good luck with the podcasts.
Thanks a lot, Billy.
Cheers, mate. Bye-bye.
Well, there you go. What an absolute joy. The magnificent Billy Bragg joining me on episode 114. A real pleasure to have him on. Do check out the show notes for this podcast for more information, including details of Billy's latest studio album, his 10th, The Million Things That Never Happened, which is just fantastic. Details on my website, paulwellerfanpodcast.com. Now, if you've enjoyed that episode, please do share it on your social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Let's spread the word. Billy Bragg on the Paul Weller Fan Podcast, right? And if you enjoyed it, you can also buy me a virtual coffee as well. Just head to my website, paulwellerfanpodcast.com, and click on the store button. Doing that this week, Andy Tolcher, hi to you. Brian G, thanks for your donation. Andrew Duncan says, thanks, Dan, for a great podcast. Looking forward to Billy Bragg. I hope you enjoyed it, Andrew. Mike Steer, hi to you. Kevin Smith, hello. Paul Viola, Joy Beth Bell, Ewan, Andy Liddell. Great show this week, mate. Keep up the good work. Bless your friend. Jen Howard says, keep up the brilliant work. I love it. Brian, thanks to you. Sam Molnar, hello, mate. Loving your work, Dan. Keep it up. Alex McLaughlin says, keep on keeping on, Dan. Russ Ratton, brilliant, mate. Keep it going. Stephen Cartwright, hi to you. Says, brilliant podcast, Dan. I've listened to them all and some of them twice or more, with Tufty and Shane being my most played. Keep up the good work, pal. Thanks, Stephen. Andy Forrester, brilliant podcast, Dan. Loved all the guests, especially Ann Weller. Keep at it. Anne was fantastic. You're right. Billy J, love the podcast, pal. Keep it up. Patrick, love the podcast, Dan. Hope for many more till you meet the man himself. Ali L, thanks for the brilliant content, Dan. Paul Hubbard, keep it up. The best part of the week, pal. Thank you, mate. Stu Burns, keep on keeping on. Dick Cherry says, thanks, Dan. The podcast has rejuvenated my love of all things Weller and cost me a fortune in CDs, vinyls, books, DVDs. All worth it. Keep up the good work. Thanks, Dick. John Fawkes, the vast majority of Weller coverage is the same angle, the same rehash of the same stories you've heard a million times before, not with Dan and his amazing podcast. Thank you, John. That means a lot, mate. Jane, the Jam Tart with a Heart, says, keep up the fab work. Colin, keep up the good work, Dan. Loving this and all the guests, books, tunes, photos. My Christmas list grows each week. Brilliant. Nicholas George Keane, hello to you. Steve says, great work, Dan. Hope this goes a little way to helping. Rachel, the Jam Tart, here's your morning coffee for the rest of the week. Thank you to you. Duncan and Brian, thanks for all your donations. Wow, what a week. Really, really appreciate it. If you want to get involved, just head to my website, paulwellerfanpodcast.com. Cheers to everyone. That's really kind. Really appreciate it, everybody. Now, if you want to get in touch on social media, you can do so. Twitter @WellerFanPod, or go to Instagram and Facebook, Paul Weller Fan Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next time.